Welcome, everybody, to the 2023 National Oration from the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. We organised by the ACT division of the ATSE Fellowship. We welcome guests from all over Australia and from Asia and other regions to this national oration, which will be presented by Professor Brian Schmidt, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, on the disrupted futures of Australian universities. Allow me to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet and work, in our case, the Ngunnawal people, and to pay respect to the traditional leaders, past, present, and emerging, and also to acknowledge their important traditional knowledge that feeds into our education and research systems. My name is John Dixon. I am chair of the ACT Division Committee, and it's my very great honour to welcome and to introduce Nobel Laureate Professor Brian Schmidt, currently Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University as well as President of the University, who will provide the address to us today. These topics related to education and the future of our higher education capacities and facilities is very much a hot button item within Australia, but it's also very much aligned with the STEM focus of a lot of the Academy's work. So we're very fortunate to have Professor with us who will speak to the stress that's presently placed upon universities to link together education, training and research, which has been the traditional model for Australian universities for a long time. And that's within a context of an enormous rapidity of technological development and scientific progress, which is also yet another pressure and opportunity for higher education. So Professor Schmidt is a path-breaking educator, a communicator, innovator, and an astrophysicist, a person who has received many awards, not least, of course, the Nobel Prize in 2011 for the breakthroughs in relation to the acceleration of the university's expansion. He's also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Sciences and of the Royal Society. He's made amazing contributions also in the space of education to Australian National University, to its connections to many other universities around the world, increased the research funding to ANU during his time, also staff members and the students, and increased the diversity, I think he might be very proud to note, as well as the levels of satisfaction of staff and students. He's championed research translation and is the current serving chair of the group of 8 universities related to research. He served also on the Prime Minister's National Science and Technology Council. And in a moment, we will pass over to Professor Schmidt. I would also like to introduce our moderator for the Q&A session, which will follow Professor Schmidt's oration. That is Dr. Joanne Daly, who has served many years as a group executive within CSIRO and also has contributed very ably to the Australian Council of Learned Academies, for example, chairing an expert working group on Australian agricultural futures. She continues to work very actively within the Australian agricultural and food system sector on boards, for example, and has received from the Academy the President's Medal for her contributions to ATSE. not least as chair of the Assembly and former chair of the ACT committee. I would now like, with great pleasure, to pass over to Professor Brian Schmidt for his national oration.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you everyone for joining us during your lunch. I too am joining you from Ngambri Ngunnawal land here in Canberra. I'm here in my office in the Chancery of the Australian National University, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm going to give people a little dyspepsia today because we are in a time of great change. And I want us to think about that change to make sure we manage it so that we get at the end of the change an even better system that serves Australia well. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But to understand the present, we need to think about the past. The universities of today are still cast in the model of medieval Europe. That is, we are a community of teachers given administrative autonomy for the determination and realization of our curricula. We are given the freedom to undertake research of our own choosing, and we award publicly recognized degrees. That's what universities have been since their foundations. I have personally visited and lectured at both the University of Bologna, now 935 years old, and Oxford, 927 years old. ANU, where I am Vice Chancellor, was modeled after Oxford, and Oxford even provided our ceremonial mace that we use at all of our graduations. Our robes, our ceremonies, our degrees, our traditions, our governance, the foundational set of expectations of what we are, all hark back nearly a millennium to these first institutions. It is actually quite remarkable how resilient universities have been. But of course, much has changed. Rather than restrictions to the seven liberal arts of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, which of course we still do, and music, universities cater to any and all areas of studies, with new areas emerging on a semi-regular basis. Despite the evolution, for far too many years, universities were elite institutions. In England, pre-1920, less than 2% of the population graduated from university. 100 years later, in 2020, it was 40%. But for most of our history, we have not been connected to the average person. In 1920, while there was the occasional Wunderkid, most all graduates were drawn from wealthy families. It was a centuries-old tradition where the first son of landed gentry was most likely to go off to university, and that's what filled our ranks. And of course, other sons went off to the military, the clergy, or trades. And it was, of course, almost entirely a male process until the early 1800s. Everything changed after World War II. Universities became deeply connected to the sovereign capability of a nation. German universities were the Humboldtian tradition that model integrated arts and sciences with research to achieve both comprehensive general learning, cultural knowledge, and the ability to progress the frontiers of humanity. Well, that delivered a highly prosperous and powerful Germany in the mid-19th century. It's not surprising that American and English universities followed suit, creating research universities. And if one looks to the outcomes of World War II, where the balance of the war was put into favor by the Allies, by their English and American universities, and here I'm thinking radar, penicillin, code cracking, and nuclear bombs, it's no wonder that in the post-war era, universities were top of mind of nations. My university, ANU, of course, was founded because of this in 1946 in the spirit of post-war optimism, but I would say also because of what were the outcomes of World War II. We were a case in point. Australia dug deep and brought together Oliphant, who was, of course, involved at the core of both radar and nuclear bombs. brought Florey in with his discovery of penicillin. He became a chancellor, but helped design the university. And Kenneth LeCouture came in, and he was part of code breaking against Enigma and other things. They all were brought together to help start this new university. A time of intense change within societies post-World War II, universities suddenly opened up to the average male citizen, and I use the word male because that's what it was, and that was through the education of soldiers returning home. And later, we had, a few decades later, public subsidy of universities for places to study. They suddenly went from being an elite where people had to pay everything for them to suddenly becoming public institutions funded largely by government. At the same time, the research revolution, which was spurred on by the Cold War more than anything else, created all sorts of research spillovers into society that brought about a rapid rise of prosperity, hefty income premiums for those with a university degree. That is, you made more money if you went to university than if you didn't, and an exponential increase in the size of universities because they were delivering all this good. It meant that we had much larger faculties and many more students. If ever there has been a golden age for universities, it has been in the last 75 years. But despite the enormous scale of change of universities worldwide, the basics of how universities work economically and within society have remained remarkably true to their centuries-old traditions. I should say, at least we claim to adhere to these customs. I'm not convinced that they actually aren't being undermined right now, despite what we say. In addition, what a society is asking for universities for the future is now beginning to diverge from what we provided in the past. That is why it's a time of inflection. These characteristics make our sector vulnerable to a major disruption, not unlike the taxi industry or what the Luddites fought in the early 19th century. Let's just think at some of the major demand trends I see here in Australia. Approximately 30 to 40% of people are now going to university for a degree. But if we look at the Universities Accord interim working paper, well, it's set that target to be as high as 55% by 2050. This would require a doubling of the number of university students by 2050. And while university graduates enjoy better salaries than their non-university peers, the slice of the earning pie is diminishing as the number of people who go to university increases. And this ultimately suggests that the graduate premium is going to be smaller, and the financial incentives to go to university for the average person might well diminish in the future rather than increase over time. There's a growing and boisterous call for increased skills within university degrees to make students more work ready. But there isn't a similar call for degrees to be longer. This means that students are going to need to spend less time on education and more time on skills than we are used to. While applicable skills are vital in any profession, we think about what a PhD is about. It's about teaching and the creation of new knowledge to advance society. PhD graduates are not really the people who are meant to be teaching skills, and yet they're going to become a core part of what the educational demands are of Australia into the future, much more so than now. The demand for people undertaking certain types of STEM degrees, think physical sciences, engineering, computing, is well short of demand in Australia, probably a factor of 2. But the number of people undertaking these degrees or wanting to undertake them isn't shifting much. These types of STEM degrees are amongst the most expensive to teach. They're hard, and they are not seen, for whatever reason, as being that attractive to finishing high school students. On the research side, the demand for applied or translatable research is increasing, while demand, and I express this in the government's willingness to pay for it, for basic curiosity-driven research is diminishing. The total government investment in research has dropped from 2.2% of GDP 10 years ago to 1.68% of GDP, and the fraction that is curiosity-driven has halved over the last 25 years. The domestic supply of students to undertake PhDs is decreasing rapidly. These career paths are seen as precarious and definitely less financially attractive than other options for the best students. Indeed, right now, undertaking a PhD in Australia is best estimated to get rid of about half of the graduate premium you enjoyed by doing a bachelor's degree. Now, one of the reasons it's been a golden age for universities over the past 75 years is because of the continual growth of the sector. Year after year, we've had more students for our researchers to teach. We've therefore had more jobs for our graduating PhD students to go into. These PhD students' research was funded by rapidly growing GDP and an increasing share of GDP being spent on research. That is the stage from 1946 to about 2010 that we enjoyed here in Australia, but was seen throughout the Western world. While we might now be looking at needing to teach more students in the future, the total amount of money being spent on teaching and research per student is not increasing. Indeed, it's decreasing. We overproduce PhD students now by an order of magnitude compared to the academic or research jobs that they find available, and the decreasing fraction of GDP going into basic research that universities specialize in means that many academics who are currently in universities actually are not spending the nominal 40% of their time doing research, as has been the established norm in the sector. Desperate vice chancellors, count me one, and we really are not evil people, are trying to figure out how to make everything add up in our institutions in this environment. So just ask yourself, what is the easiest way to teach more students for less? Well, the simple answer that many of my colleagues have discovered is you simply hire people who do not need to spend 40% of their time and their salary doing research. Solves the problem that there's not enough grant money to go around or enough PhD students to support their research time, and you get them for almost half the cost of a normal researching PhD academic. So you can do this through hiring people on casual contracts. You can hire sessional instructors who actually can teach skills as active practitioners. And you can convert some of your existing research staff to 100% teaching positions. In some cases, because of this, universities have started to disaggregate their research and teaching to a large extent. So there are those who teach and those who research, but many fewer people who do both. And if we're honest about it, kind of makes sense. Those who teach well could teach well. Those who research well, they can research well. Students can get outstanding teacher from instructors who specialize in this as their profession, and researchers will have 100% of their time to appropriately use their expensive equipment and have the time to appropriately mentor their PhD students to achieve outstanding research. But we're not honest about it. We pretend that every bachelor's degree in Australia is the same with research-led teaching, that there is enough research support for each of those professors, and that undertaking a career path aimed at being a university professor is an attractive proposition to our best and brightest students. What we are doing instead, by ignoring the reality that we face, is creating a class of precarity. Gig economy academics who largely feel betrayed by the dream sold to them when they started their PhD. Now, the question I ask myself is, does this make universities the taxi plate owners of 10 years ago? We simultaneously have restricted entry into our sector. That is, not anyone can give a degree. Our staff are feeling increasingly disenfranchised from our business. And many of our students, sometimes we call them customers, and that's a label, may I say, gives me a shudder, are not really after what we're offering. That is, they pride themselves on not attending classes, spending the least amount of time on our campuses as possible, and getting a degree with as little fuss as possible. Our Uber will be an organization that can give students what they want, cheaper, faster, and better than what universities are currently delivering for many of our students. So then I asked myself, what is the value of universities to modern students who can get skills in education and highly engaged teaching at skills much cheaper at potentially other institutions than what our current modern universities offer? Especially think this is true because you can imagine having players who don't have to fund academic freedom and research, but are able to deliver the teaching outcomes that students want. They're going to be interesting competitors. Now, I firmly believe that academic freedom and teachers who are outstanding research are an essential part of a vibrant academic research environment. But it's not clear to me that all students benefit equally from this very expensive environment. Or maybe more importantly, that their future employers think they do and are prepared to pay a premium. Now, the success of Uber relied on taking the taxi license out of the hands of a middleman and instead putting it directly in the hands of driver and passenger. That is, the taxi owner or the plate owner was disintermediated. For universities, our future competition will be those who disintermediate our credentials. Like the taxi industry, the university system is right now a closed shop. We're regulated here in Australia through TEXA, and we can give a degree, and no one else can unless they meet this high bar of self-accreditation. And as someone who's going through that self-accreditation right now, it's a high bar. I'm surprised, actually, that we do not already face fierce competition on external credentialing. Imagine a digital credentialing platform run by LinkedIn. It could provide a rich, interrogable record of degrees, qualifications, experiences, and skills from any source around the world. Your bachelor's in physics with honors will sit alongside your more recent quantum computing certificate that you earned with Microsoft and your machine learning qualification you got from completing the Fast AI course. You can then add your experience you gained when you worked for Google Research and training large language models. As an employer, you get a rich record of a person's knowledge, skills, and experiences, independent of what country they did their work in, and you can automatically make a query worldwide for people who represent a list of candidates you might want to sign up for a job. I mean, as someone who might be looking for jobs, sign me up. And may I say, I did actually pitch this idea in Davos 4 years ago to LinkedIn, and I guess I'm waiting to see if they take it up. We shall see. At first, this doesn't look like a threat to universities, right? Everyone wins. But this actually is a platform where things other than a university degree can connect people to their next job, where alternative suppliers of qualifications get a foot in the door. And this is not a bad thing. The marketplace will soon sort out which credentials and skill sets are the most valuable. And to the level that a traditional university degree provides strong value compared to other things, everything should be fine. But that last statement is an important one. To the level that a traditional university degree provides strong value compared to other things, everything should be fine. So I want you to imagine who competitive players might be in this space. Imagine a massive tech company, think Google, Microsoft, Amazon, paired with a leading university brand, think Harvard or Oxford. They provide a massively scaled up, digitally delivered degree to tens of thousands of people at a time in areas where this course, this credential, or even this degree is extremely attractive to large numbers of people. The lecturers will be amongst the best in the world. The pedagogy made sure to be at the bleeding edge. The digital experience immaculate. Now, a lot of students are doing these types of degrees in universities all around the world. They're avoiding lectures and they're avoiding campus. They're working typically a full-time job. This system I've just described by our new competitors almost certainly will give a better version of the education that many of the universities that are actually providing it now are doing today. And it will be done for a fraction of the cost. Right now in Australia, it's only I see the HEX system linking into accredited suppliers that stands in the way of this. One thing running a university is you realize these types of courses are the cash cows of universities right now. They provide the large student numbers and financial underpinnings of the much broader suite of offerings we provide, including our research active staff. So an obvious response to a policymaker is to forget that and say, thanks for your idea, Brian. Let's let the market rip. It'll be great. But not all of a university's important activities will be replaced, just the lucrative ones. Students working in less mainstream areas will likely not find their course. Research will not be funded. And students will be thinking very short term about their education and skills. So here's one way that our universities can truly add value in my view, because many students, and not all, but many students will benefit from undertaking a broad-based bachelor's degree, living on campus, perhaps undertaking professional study thereafter. An 18-year-old gaining independence in a semi-protective environment, building up a social and relational network over several years, and learning a wide range of things that are not pre-canned and like what everyone else in the world is learning. Well, that's the way to build up a critical thinking intellect. And indeed, that is, of course, the notion for universities over the past 900 years, what we've been meaning to do. The value of universities is also how we will train future academics and researchers who actually do push the foundations of knowledge beyond those things that are just commercially lucrative at the time. And that work, quite hard to nail down in economic analysis, because most of the benefit is in indirect spillovers, is far more important to our future prosperity than I think most people realize. Certainly than what most politicians realize. Unfortunately, I also believe there's a fundamental mismatch coming up between the research needs of the country and Australia's university teaching needs. What do I mean by this? So if the Accord interim report is right, then we need to educate 55% of Australians within universities by 2050. We are going to need to effectively double the number of university lecturers if we stick with the current model. Unfortunately, the subjects and expertise of these lecturers are unlikely to be that aligned with the specific research needs of the country. Now, the specific research needs of the country might be quantum sensing, rare earths, geoeconomic modeling of the Indo-Pacific region, and creation of nitrogen-fixing wheat. And while we will need some people educated in these areas, we will not need hundreds of thousands of people. But we may well be spending billions of dollars in research in those areas. Already, as I've alluded to earlier, Australia is unable to support the research time of its university lecturers. This aspect of our system is propped up to some degree by international students' income, which is at best a risky proposition to continue at its current level for the next 20 years. So unless Australia is prepared to make a transition to becoming a research powerhouse, that is for the government to double or even triple its research expenditure within universities and grow the business sector accordingly, and this audience would love it to do that, for us to become a US or a Sweden, I really don't see how we provide the higher education needs of the future with the current system. So I want us to think towards a dystopic future, 20 years hence. Employers around the world use digital credentials, and due to public demand, HEX has opened up to a wide range of high-quality digital providers. 55% of young people are taking these digital courses, 90% of which is concentrated into the 20 courses of highest demand. We finally have a way to treat our nurses, our IT specialists, But in the process, 35 of Australia's universities out of the 40 have retreated from doing any research whatsoever. They simply can't afford to do it. They have merged with our TAFEs and are partnering with the digital providers to provide hands-on vocational experiences for our students. 5 of Australia's universities continue to do research, but they too have retreated to a much smaller cohort of students, and they're almost entirely working on campus. These students are, as in 1920, once again, drawn largely from the most educated and wealthy families. And while many go on to roles in society outside of academia, these are the students who are the source of the nation's future researchers, academics, and all of that digital teaching that we're going to rely on. Much of the research is now not in the university. It's in semi-autonomous research institutes, which contribute to teaching in their areas of expertise, but quite frankly, largely are divorced from teaching because they're there to do research. Australians, politicians of the time describe our system as one of the most efficient in the world, with the lowest cost per capita of higher education in the OECD. Our research expenditure as a function of GDP has continued on its downward trajectory. Our productivity growth is lower than what we want, and we don't really understand why. And we slowly slide down the OECD in GDP per capita as a middle income nation rather than one of the most wealthy. And I ask, can we improve on this feature? And I think we can. Major high-quality digital higher education providers are coming. We're not going to stop them. We don't want to stop them, and we need to embrace them because they offer a lot to a lot of people. But we need to empower universities to add value beyond just these offerings, because those offerings are going to be short-term for the average person, mass consumption. This means funding and holding universities accountable to partner and bring local aspects, local knowledge to the education that's provided, to make sure we provide research and spillovers that make sense to Australia and to the different regions and citizens in our university's midst. We need to be given the ability to build up social and relational aspects that the students need to prosper. Very difficult to do that digitally. And we need to ensure that we continue to be able to teach a broad range of subjects and that there's sufficient research undertaken in those subjects to ensure that our nation doesn't get pigeonholed into what was and can focus on what might be in the future. That's how we keep productivity increasing. Our current system has emerged from a one-size-fits-all set of rules. It provides resources just sufficient to fund education in typical courses in large metropolitan campuses. Universities fund their distinctive missions right now and the value add that we do with international student fees. It's really the only funding stream that currently provides resources substantially in excess of the bare minimum actual activity. It means that rural regional universities have opened up capital city campuses catering to international students, while metropolitan universities like my own cater to larger and larger numbers of international students through a combination of enrolling them on campus, teaching them digitally remote where it makes sense, and of course, even opening up shop in providing foreign-based degrees overseas. This system is highly dependent on the current economic rents that can be extracted from the international market and is therefore ripe for disruption by our Uber. There are a few significant changes that I think can help. And since it's the time of the accord, let's think about it. What can we do right now? My first suggestion is that universities cannot just be funded solely on the lowest price activity, and that's it. We need adequate core funding to undertake our missions. Now, I'm the beneficiary at ANU. We received the National Institute grant, and that enabled ANU to become one of the world's great comprehensive research universities. Our core, unfortunately, of funding is ever dwindling in real terms, and we already right now across the world have the smallest budget for a top-ranked comprehensive university in the world. There is no university in the world as good as ANU that is even 30% less or more expensive than us. That is, we're cheap. But it shows how having mission-based funding can be very effective. ANU, of course, does that and specializes in areas of specific need for the country. But it's not just ANU's research mission here that matters. If you want a Charles Darwin University to cater to the very complex needs of Northern Territory, or Charles Sturt to cater to regional New South Wales needs, it's not going to emerge from the current one-size-fits-all system. My second idea is pretty obvious. Australia must fully fund its sovereign research capability and not rely on international sources to prop it up. We are the only country in the world crazy enough to prop up our sovereign research capability with international funds. It produces huge distortions and vulnerabilities into our higher education system that we're all feeling right now as the continued shocks of COVID go through our system. So those are my two big asks for the Accord. But those two asks provide a system that will give you universities that can value add as this disruption occurs. These changes provide the grounding to a future system where healthy research and teaching ecosystem can survive. Now, even with these changes, there is going to be a huge amount of disruption in our system as we see high-quality digital providers come in en masse and suck up some of the main things we do right now. But if we get a mission-based system with research adequately focused on, we can keep our value add going. And we can ensure that these changes eventually, after a fairly traumatic period, end up giving us an Australian that is actually better served by its education system, is more prosperous, and is more productive. So let's not just go with the flow, let things rip, and find ourselves a less knowledgeable and poor nation in the future. If we do, we may find ourselves set back 1,000 years, a new medieval era for research and teaching, when instead we need something that will support us to take on the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. That was a very exciting and stimulating presentation. I was thinking about my own life throughout my own career doing research and how different the world has become, I think, for young people today and the sort of challenges they face in acquiring a higher education. Now, the questions and answers are open. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that if you wish to ask a question, you need to put it in there rather than coming online. So while people think of questions, and I was specifically interested, I know we have a number of media outlets potentially online, if they could actually put a question in the Q&A, I'll ask those questions for you. But I've got a question here from John Dixon, Brian. It says, should we be concerned about the warning from A.C. Grayling of Oxford that society is threatened by our own failure to integrate the link between natural sciences and humanities? And I guess if I could extend that question, if we go to a digital world which is student-driven, will we end up fragmenting society because students will actually do courses that reinforce their own preconceptions rather than the challenge that universities provide, in which they can actually open people's minds to alternate viewpoints? Thank you.
Yeah, so that is one of the, and I think you've very eloquently expressed one of the things that I am worried about, which is that when everyone goes and learns the same set of 20 skills from the same teacher, no matter how good it is, we become quite one-dimensional. And it becomes harder and harder for creativity to come in and synthesis of new ideas to occur. That is, we become highly skilled, but we don't necessarily become highly educated. So that is a way for us to asymptote as a species in terms of our research, where instead of having a large fraction of those capable of, adding knowledge to the frontiers, we only end up with a tiny fraction of people given the luxury of doing it, not dissimilar to the 13th century. So I actually think it is a problem. If you look at what universities are doing right now when they get a chance, we, but not just us, all the universities around the world have these highly interdisciplinary institutes. We encourage people to do at ANU double degrees, right? You can do patent law and become an engineer at the same time. At Melbourne, the Melbourne model is really going into that Bologna model of a very broad first degree. So I think universities are trying to continue to do that. But if people are only thinking about, I need people skilled in this way, then, and we're going to pay only on that, we're going to lose a lot of those people. Now, I'm also going to be honest that not every student needs to have a deeply immersive, broad education taught by the leading thinkers in the world. They're just not that interested. They have other things that they're good at. And so that's why we need a more diverse system. That's not one size fits all, where, essentially everyone, you kind of do a bachelor's degree or nothing in the university system. That's not completely true, but it's largely true. And so I do think we need to have a more complex network of skill-based and knowledge-based degrees that students can choose from and, quite frankly, dip in and out of through a much larger fraction of their life.
Thanks, Brian. Another question is, you raised the issue of actually dipping in and out of education. So have we limited ourselves by saying, well, a degree is a 3-year experience or 4-year experience, and then you go into the world? Should we actually change our mindset around what getting a degree actually means? That is something that maybe we never reach an end point. It's actually we accumulate skills, we accumulate courses over a much longer time period. What is the value of actually having an endpoint that says you've got a degree?
Yeah, so I think this is something that Australia does pretty well. We're much more flexible at allowing people to dip in to our education system later in life. So if you go to a University of New England, for example, they have a very large fraction of their undergraduates are mature age students who are dipping into education later in life. And this is a huge opportunity within the digital realm where more mature people who, are at a different stage of life want to get educated in the next round of things. But you can imagine we're seeing more and more people coming in and doing PhDs in their 30s and 40s. And can I say they do outstanding work? I went straight from undergraduate to a PhD. That's what you did. But honestly, I see some of the most outstanding PhDs nowadays from students coming in after 10 or 15 years out of academia. They're very focused. They have wisdom. And so I think that's going to be increasingly a part of what we do. But there's going to be a whole range of other things. Not everyone needs a PhD or a bachelor's degree. 3 months of data analytics, so you can rehome your linear algebra and go through and, do a modern statistical analysis using machine learning or whatever. That's going to be useful for more people. So I do think we have an opportunity as part of the new ecosystem and the missions of universities is to make sure that we fund the opportunity for people to dip in to university education for essentially whenever they need to in their life. The challenge is we're used to people using an income contingent loan. You're later in life, the payback's not so clear. We want your employer to pay for it, but there's a concern of people going off once they get their credential and not paying back to employers. So there's a bit of social engineering that's going to need to occur to figure out how we get people incentivized to do this.
Thank you. Janine Herzig has opened up a very important topic, which is around that we may well have critical areas of knowledge that Australia needs, but there are no universities in Australia offering that a degree in its purest form. And she has focused on metallurgical engineering, an area that's fundamental to critical and rare minerals, which, as we know, is actually underpinning our transition from fossil fuels into a fossil-free future. So how do we deal with this in the future when we actually have a gap in our expertise that we can offer in education experience?
So I can tell you right now, universities, if we can figure out how to fund something, we tend to jump to things very quickly. Indeed, if someone were to come up and say, we'll give you 25 students a year in this area in research funding, we would open up a department immediately. So the challenge then is there genuinely a need for this? And I would say in that area, there almost certainly is. I have geophysicists who work on the periphery of that, and we can see how being able to extract rare earths, for example, and process them here in Australia is going to be a huge thing. And that's not something we really do very well, as indicated. So I would describe it as a market failure. And I would ask, if you're going to have a critical minerals strategy like the government does, why is it not investing in those things as part of the suite of activity it's doing to build up a national capability? So I'm a very strong proponent of mission-based government funding, where you can go through and have a set of experts say, we want to develop a capability that produces this many tons of, vanadium or something by 2040. What do we need to do to achieve that goal? And they invest where there's market failure, try to work with universities, work with business to maximize that as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible. Not dissimilar to, being told we got to get to the moon by 1970. What does it take to do? So I think there's a lot that we could do in that, but it just doesn't tend to emerge naturally from a bunch of small little players trying to get their head around how they might possibly be part of a not yet established ecosystem around critical minerals. So I think it's a classic market failure. And in the end, it's going to have to be the government who I think sorts that out as cheaply as possible.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Natasha Bitter from The Australian. She says, you describe some degrees as cash cows for universities. If the digital competitors take away this revenue source, how can universities afford to conduct curiosity research? Should this be funded directly by the taxpayer in the same way that defence spending is? And can you quantify how much more research funding universities would require from what they currently get? And do you think Australia has too many universities offering similar courses? Should they merge or specialise? So it's really about where's the cash going to come in the future for research, the research intensive work that you're talking about? How much more do we need than we currently have? And really, would the country benefit by merging universities merging or specialising?
So there's a lot there. And so at some point we need to send up, I think, a quasi market for what things know based on what the government wants to invest in. So right now we have a situation in this country where education, largely international, but a little bit domestic, cross-subsidizes research. That is not the case. If you go to the United States, the rich universities are they're rich actually because they get huge amounts of government grants that actually pay for the research that they're asking for. That's not true in Australia. Australia goes through and says, we're going to give you this amount and, you guys have to find all of the underlying costs and we don't care how you do it. But if you don't provide them, then you're not going to get the research money. So I think that is a policy hole, because ultimately curiosity-driven research, because it has all these spillovers, is a classic place of market failure. No, BHP isn't going to do basic research because they can't get the spillovers and get money from it. So that is a place where almost every major economy in the world, make sure that research is paid for by the government when it's basic research. So I just don't see how we have any sensible model where where basic research is not paid for by the Australian taxpayer. With respect to the degrees and everything, I don't think you want to design the university system. You want to give a sensible set of funding lines that are appropriate for what you want the university system to do. Does it make sense that, for example, if you are the University of Sydney and have a dentistry program, and we need dentists, that they teach every single one of those students at a gigantic loss? Does that make sense? It doesn't to me. I'm very grateful I don't have a dentistry school because, gosh, just what I need, another loss-making faculty. But we need dentists. So this whole notion that we need things to occur, but they are not actually funded appropriately, is a gigantic failure of the system here. It's a gigantic failure of the system. It needs to be addressed. If you give people a cornucopia of choices, the market can see what it wants. Students are going to do what they think's best. If we make it so that, getting a basic broad education is valuable, students will choose that, research will be funded, then the universities will try to optimize as best they can. Okay. And we can see this happening in Adelaide, where, UniSA and Adelaide are optimizing against the current system. And that's what they're trying to do. And if we don't want them to merge, the question is that just for history, or is there a reason for it? I promise you, they're not merging for kicks and giggles. They're doing it because that's the only way they can see forward to survive in the current environment. In the same way, if we just, if we don't pay attention to what we want as a society, you may find out that we end up with, only a couple, 500,000 person universities that just kind of franchise across the country. Is that what we want? Well, I don't think that's what you want, because you're not going to get the vitality and diversity of research and education. But the policy has to reflect what the outcome of society wants, rather than we're going to just build it into what's the minimum transaction of a student and the minimum transaction of research. Let it go. We'll open up the international market and everything will be fine. So that's the system we have right now.
Thank you. One of the concerns raised by one of the listeners is that if we go to, say, to an Uber model of university education, which I guess, and some lucky people get the chauffeur-driven limousine, will it perpetuate the social and economic divides that in our society? And will we go back to what we had, pre-1920?
Well, that's my dystopia. Absolutely. It's in my dystopia, I describe we have the lowest cost of education per capita in the world, but we get almost certainly a huge divide between the haves and the have-nots again. And we need to ensure that whatever Uber version of education we get in the future is what we have, and that is, it augments and improves what we have. It doesn't disintermediate and destroy what we have. Okay. And that's why my solutions for the Accord are kind of tuned to be the things that will stabilize and allow universities to have a mission that adds on to massified, high quality education that's probably done by a private provider, rather than just have us be destroyed because our underlying business model is destroyed. And then we can't do all the other things in society that we probably do need to do to help keep productivity and prosperity on the rise.
Is it about making sure we have good connections between this digital environment and the campus-based university, so we don't end up with that divide that would be very damaging to society?
we certainly need to make sure that the interdependency that exists right now, it's not really designed into the system, it's just not thought about. We need to really think about what is it that we want universities to do and make sure that we don't lose that capability in the disruptive possibility. I mean, if we're genuinely Luddites and we genuinely don't add value, then we should disappear. We should go the way of the dinosaur. But I'm arguing that research and then certain types of education are not going to be catered to by this model. And if that's true, we need to make sure we fund it appropriately.
Thank you. I've got a question from an early career researcher who I guess raises the issue about, are we eating our young? I think this is referring to increasing the precariousness of the funding streams for early career scientists. In fact, they end up in their mid-career. So how do we manage this cohort of people if we are to transition into the future? We don't want to lose a whole tranche of our early to mid-career researchers because they just can't be supported to do the kind of work they need to do.
So we need to design a system to be in equilibrium. So the system was in equilibrium before because it actually wasn't in equilibrium. As I indicated, it was growing, and that allowed it to appear to be in equilibrium because every year there were more and more people being put into the giant pyramid of higher education. So that growth is no longer occurring, and I don't see it occurring like it did post-World War II. So if we're going to be in equilibrium, we need to make sure that PhDs and the subsequent career are attractive. And how do we do that? Well, we have an honest conversation with PhD students and make sure that their precarity, doing a PhD should not give you worse life outcomes than not doing one. It doesn't necessarily have, no one goes into doing PhDs for the money, but it shouldn't give you a life of precarity. It shouldn't be a terrible thing to do to your career. So I honestly, until we are able to create a larger ability to absorb PhDs within business and government, so outside the sector, I can honestly say we need to produce fewer PhDs, and that will disrupt how we do research in this country. There's no doubt about it. But I do think we need to kind of have a compact with our graduating PhD students that a certain fraction of them will be able to move and stay in academia and have a reasonable life there. One that's not, hand to mouth for 17 years on soft money. And the ones who don't stay in that will have great jobs outside of academia. And, that's sort of the way it was when I finished. It was still tough, but at least there was some semblance of normalcy to it. And we're going to have to tune the number of PhD students we train until we get that equilibrium into something that, quite frankly, allows the best and brightest, which we need to thrive. Research is not going to do well if we don't have really, really capable people in it. It's not going to be able to fulfill its mission. So we need to make it attractive somehow for those people and treat them well. But I think ultimately that probably means fewer people getting PhDs and fewer people doing research within our system. You just can't sustain 10% success rates like we're seeing in the NHMRC. We just can't.
Brian, we're almost up for time, but there's a number of really important questions. I'm going to give you two questions, and it's your choice as to which one you answer. So there's been a question around how do you convince governments to fund indirect costs, which you talk about core funding, the overheads that universities need simply to open the doors and get going, because that's not well funded, it's not well recognised. But the other question I think is very interesting. If you're going to have this very transformative, disruptive change in university education, what's the role of schools here to prepare students for this future world? I mean, are they adequately preparing students for a world that will be transformative?
All right, two very different questions there. On the first one, I'll just quickly say, the whole systems are going to start falling apart. You want nuclear physicists to help on AUKUS subs. We're not going to get that delivered unless something happens, because we just can't afford to do it. I run a HIAF here at ANU, and that'll bankrupt us unless something happens soon. So it will fix itself quickly, because they're just not going to be able to get what they want, in my opinion. So having a strong conversation, and I think there are some avenues that we might be able to sort that. With respect to having university or higher education ready students, we have a real problem here. I like to use PISA, because PISA is internationally benchmarked, and it's a test that's not taught to. So it gets rid of all the game playing that we see in NAPLAN. And that demonstrates a monotonic decrease in all areas in all subjects in the 20 years that the test has been going. Indeed, the ACT this year finally bucked the trend in 2 of the 3 subjects, got an uptick. Now, we're the wealthiest jurisdiction in the country. It's great we've been able to figure out how to do it, but that has to be a national mission to get people university ready. And I'm going to sound like my great-grandfather. I need people to get out of high school with some semblance of values, so they're not psychopaths and they're not awful to each other. I need them to be able to read, and I need them to be able to write, and I need them to be able to be numerate. That's what I need. If I get someone with those skills, they can do any degree at ANU, and our degrees here are as hard as anywhere in the world. We benchmark with Caltech, MIT, Cambridge, right? That's all I need. We tend to worry and give people a whole bunch of other stuff. And I really think we need to focus on just the basics for a while and make it entertaining and make sure it's engaging. But we really need to focus on those simple numbers of things. I actually don't care how much they get, quite frankly, in direct training in physics or science. I'd much rather them have the calculus, quite frankly, at this point. And as I said, I know that makes me sound like a barbarian from 150 years ago, but it's how I see it. So we absolutely have to get our students ready for the 21st century when they graduate, whether or not they want to go to university or not.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. That's been a wonderful session, actually. It's very stimulating, and I think everybody online will have enjoyed it enormously. I just want to remind people that this talk will be available online in the coming period. I'm not quite sure what the time period is. So you can actually revisit it or watch it again. And so thank you. But thank you, Brian, very much, and all the best for your future. As you
Thank you very much. And
astronomy, I think. Yeah.
Indeed. Looking forward to merging neutron stars.
It might be easier than merging universities, I'll tell you.
Well, we'll see. We'll see how that happens. Be interesting.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Bye.